I went to a romantic dinner with my wife. I chose a dimly lit restaurant, one of those with live music in the background and discreet waiters, where the wine is always at the right temperature and the food seems to have been made to accompany promises of love. We were there, face to face, after weeks of trying to rekindle something that seemed to have been lost a long time ago among bills, silences, habits. She was beautiful, absurdly beautiful. She had put on the blue dress that I liked so much, and she smiled as if she wanted to make me forget everything. And I, foolishly, believed her. I believed that she also wanted to start over. I believed that we were there to rebuild something, to remember who we were. Until he appeared. Walking confidently between the tables, as if he belonged there. He didn't look away, nor did he hesitate. He stopped next to our table and, without any ceremony, extended his hand to her. And she stood up. Just like that. Without saying anything. Without even looking at me. She stood up and held his hand as if she had found the right path again. I froze. There was a void in my head. Only one sentence came to mind: what is this guy doing? I stood up instinctively. I didn't know if I was going to hit him, yell at her, or just break down right there, in front of everyone. But I did. I went up to him and said, in the strongest voice I could muster, "Let her go now." He looked at me with an irritating calm, as if he owned the truth, and replied, "Didn't she tell you about us?" The sentence was a shot. A silent shot that went through my chest. She looked away. She didn't deny it. She didn't say anything. She just held his hand tighter, as if confessing everything in that gesture. And there, in that moment, my entire life fell apart. I went home alone. The rain beat against the windshield as if mocking my pain. On the radio, a cheesy song made everything more pathetic. I sat on the dark couch in the living room and relived every detail of the last few months. The excuses for arriving late, the long showers, the long silences at dinner. It was all there, screaming at me. I just didn't want to see it. I was blind. I was stupid. I was too in love to realize that she hadn't been with me for a long time. But that night, sitting in the shadows of my own defeat, I knew exactly what to do: move on. Not to forget her, but to find myself again. To remember who I was before I lost myself trying to please someone who no longer wanted me. I spent months rebuilding myself. Days in silence, nights crying in the dark. But I got up. I started walking, reading, living. Little by little, my house stopped smelling like her memories, her weight. Little by little, I started smiling again. I started liking my reflection in the mirror again. And one day, I met someone else. Not someone who came to fill in the gaps, but someone who saw me. Someone who listened to me without rushing, who smiled without intentions, who made me feel peace without effort. And it was in this new beginning, in this new calm, that the other appeared. She knocked on my door as if time had stopped. She had a distressed look on her face, her hair was disheveled, and there was urgency in her voice. She wanted to talk, she wanted to understand, she wanted to go back. She said she regretted it, that nothing she had experienced with the other person was real. That she missed my embrace, my smell, our routine. She said she had made a mistake trying to look for what she already had here outside. But it was late. Too late. And she saw it in my eyes. Because when she asked me for a second chance, my response was just a sad smile. And a look at the room where another woman was waiting for me, the one who held my hand without shame, without secrets, without an unresolved past. Her betrayal broke me in a way that I thought I would never be able to put the pieces back together. But in the end, it was exactly this break that made me rebuild everything from scratch. It hurt. A lot. But it freed me. Because sometimes, the greatest gift that life gives us is precisely losing the person who hurts us. And it was by losing her that I gained myself back. But what no one imagined, what not even she suspected, is that I already knew about the betrayal weeks before that dinner. That none of that was a coincidence. That I chose that restaurant. That I knew he would be there. That that night was my farewell. And what she never knew, is that that sad smile I gave at the end, was of someone who finally got their revenge, not with screams, not with hate, but with silence and indifference. Because sometimes, the real punishment, is discovering that you no longer mean anything to the person who once gave you everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect real pain. They were created to show, in depth, how betrayal is capable of destroying homes, families and hearts. Get ready, because what comes next is an intense, surprising and shocking story. We wish you a good story. They met on a cloudy Sunday, at a simple late afternoon event where no one expected to find anything other than idle chatter and lukewarm snacks. But at that moment, amidst the boredom and the barely perceptible background music, Daniel's eyes met Elena's, and everything seemed to change tone. There was a delicacy in the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, a naturalness that made him forget what he was saying. He, a dedicated and methodical engineer, carried on his face the tiredness of someone who had always been more useful than admired. She, a high school literature teacher, had a restless soul, marked by the sensitivity of the words she read and taught. The conversation between the two flowed effortlessly, as if they had known each other from other lives. And that night, when the wind cooled and the sky fell into a light rain, Daniel offered his coat. Elena accepted, without saying anything. And that seemingly trivial gesture was the first brick in a construction that would last for years. Their relationship grew calmly and consistently. Daniel was the kind of man who liked to plan everything: dates, birthdays, holidays, dinners. He had a notebook where he wrote down ideas to surprise her, the new restaurant in town, a book she mentioned casually, a song that seemed to have been written for her. Elena, more spontaneous, liked to disorganize his world a little. Sometimes she left her cell phone on silent, sometimes she changed plans at the last minute, sometimes she said what she thought without much of a filter, which put him on alert. But he never tried to change that about her. On the contrary, he loved precisely what he couldn't control. And she loved his firmness, the way he made her feel that everything had its right place in the world, including her. The years passed and brought with them the wedding, a simple ceremony, surrounded by close friends and a few family members. Elena didn't want a fancy dress or a grand party, she just wanted it to be light and genuine. Daniel was moved when he saw her walking towards him, with tears in her eyes, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. And for a long time, it was like that, light and genuine. The routine didn't weigh them down, the silences were comfortable, the smiles came effortlessly. They shared a cozy house with furniture they had chosen together, a bookshelf that grew every month, a small balcony where they had coffee on Sundays. The world seemed to fit inside that home. Over time, the natural challenges of adulthood began to set in. Daniel took on a new position at his company, which required longer hours and constant travel. Elena threw herself headfirst into a reading project with her students, something that made her feel like she was changing the world, even if just one little bit at a time. The house became quieter during the week. Dinners, once filled with wine and idle conversation, were replaced by solitary meals and quick text messages. There was still love, yes. But it began to share space with tiredness, with accumulated sleep, with the responsibilities of everyday life. It was a less blatant, more silent love. More mature, some would say. But inside, an emptiness began to take shape, subtle, almost imperceptible. Daniel missed Elena, even when she was in the same room. Sometimes he would watch her reading on the couch, with her feet tucked up and her hair tied up in a mess, and he would wonder when was the last time she had looked him in the eyes like she had in the early years. He wanted to talk to her, but he didn't know how. She wasn't one for scandals or demands. She thought that, with patience, everything would go back to normal. Elena, on the other hand, noticed the distance between them growing, but she tried to rationalize it. She thought it was normal, that all couples went through phases like that. And that soon, when things stabilized, love would find a way to reappear. That's why she didn't complain. That's why she smiled when he came home tired and asked how his day was. That's why she pretended not to see the absence in his eyes, the same absence that settled in hers. During their vacation that year, they decided to take a short trip to try to reconnect with what seemed to be slipping away. They went to a small coastal town, where they spent the first few days just walking, without rushing. They had candlelit dinners, laughed at silly things, and kissed like they hadn't in a long time. There were moments when it seemed like everything would really go back to the way it was before. But when they returned, life swallowed them up again. And the illusion of reconnection dissipated with the sound of their alarm clock the following Monday. The following months were marked by silent attempts at rescue. Daniel began to prepare breakfast on Sundays, as he had done in the early years. Elena began to leave notes in the drawers with quotes from books he liked. But nothing seemed to be enough. It was like trying to light a fire with wet twigs. The fire wouldn't catch. And no one said out loud what they felt: fear. Fear of admitting that they were losing each other. Fear of speaking up and the other person confirming the worst. Fear of looking in the mirror and no longer recognizing who they were together. Close friends began to notice. They discreetly commented on how Elena seemed more distracted, how Daniel was quieter. But the couple, always so reserved, didn't open the door to questions. They preferred to preserve the image of harmony, even though inside the structure was slowly crumbling. Neither of them wanted to be the first to give in, the first to admit the pain. So they continued living, side by side, like someone waiting for the storm to pass without getting wet. One Saturday night, they were invited to a couple's dinner at a new restaurant that had become the town's favorite. Daniel was hesitant to accept, but Elena insisted. He said it would be good for them to go out, to be with other people. He gave in, as he almost always did. And that night, while she was getting ready in her room, he watched her from afar. There was something different in her eyes, an old sparkle he hadn't seen in a long time. He thought about telling her how beautiful she looked, but he bit back the words. I was afraid it would sound artificial, as if I was saying it just to keep up a facade. In the car, silence accompanied them. But there was a strange tension in the air. Something Daniel couldn't name, but it made his fingers fidget on the steering wheel. They arrived at the restaurant, were greeted warmly by their friends, toasted with red wine and laughed at jokes that weren't very funny. At one point, Elena touched his hand on the table, a gesture that surprised him. He smiled back. For a moment, he thought that maybe, just maybe, there was still salvation. But inside her, a whirlwind moved silently. She was restless, her gaze wandering from side to side, as if waiting for something, or someone. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He preferred to believe that it was just an impression. He always preferred the benefit of the doubt. He always wanted to believe that their love would withstand anything. That night, when they returned home, Elena fell asleep in the passenger seat. Daniel stood in the garage for a few minutes, with the engine off, looking at her. He felt a mixture of tenderness and strangeness. She was the woman he had chosen, the woman he loved, but who now seemed as distant as an old memory. He wanted to ask her what was wrong. He wanted to understand. But he simply turned off the car and woke her up with a light touch on her shoulder. Time passed. The seasons changed. And with them, the two of them changed too. But no one said anything. They kept smiling in the photos, posting generic captions and receiving likes from people who had no idea what was going on behind those smiles. They continued living together, sharing a bed, plans, commitments, but no longer their dreams. Each one kept those to themselves. What neither of them knew was that they were about to cross a point of no return. That, soon, everything would change. That, in a simple dinner, everything that seemed stable would turn to dust. That the love that once united them would become the scene of one of the greatest pains a heart can endure. Because when trust is broken, there is no silence that can fix it. And the story that seemed to be just dormant was, in fact, on the edge of an abyss. And it was precisely at that dinner, amidst soft lights and forced smiles, that destiny began to take shape with precise, and cruel, features. Daniel began to notice small cracks in the simplest gestures. They weren't big explosions or explicit fights, but absences diluted in increasingly long silences. Elena smiled when he arrived home, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She listened, but seemed far away. He, increasingly tired, tried to hold on to the few certainties that remained, like the routine of making coffee early in the morning before leaving or touching her leg discreetly under the table when they had dinner together, like an invisible code that he was still there, trying. But she no longer responded to these touches. She didn't back away, but she didn't give in either. It was as if there was an invisible wall between them, a thick glass that separated them, allowing them to see each other but not touch. At school, Elena seemed to live a more radiant life. Her classmates noticed that she was putting on her makeup more carefully, swapping her more comfortable shoes for medium heels, and wearing striking perfumes on normal days. When they asked if there was anything new, she would deflect, laugh naturally, and say that she was just trying to feel better about herself. Daniel didn't see any problem. On the contrary, he complimented her new dresses, noticed her different lipsticks, and admired the way she seemed to want to be reborn. He thought that this was a sign of a new beginning, of her desire to regain her former charm. He didn't see what was behind it, or didn't want to see it. He began to notice, without meaning to, some changes in her behavior. She would reply to certain messages away from him, her cell phone screen would always be turned down, she would go to school more often on days without classes, with vague excuses about extra meetings. He also noticed a restlessness that had not existed before. She would look at herself in the mirror more often, she would spend more time choosing her clothes, and sometimes she would go out and come back without giving any details. Daniel tried to rationalize, telling himself that the problem was him, that he was becoming suspicious for no reason. But every gesture from Elena, no matter how delicate, seemed to sink him a little deeper into a dark pit of uncertainty. The straw that broke the camel's back came one night when he invited her to watch a movie at home. He prepared everything, popcorn, blanket, low light from the lamp, and even chose a light movie, which she always said she liked. But Elena softly refused, claiming she was tired. She went up to her room early, and when he went after her, he found her lying down, with her cell phone hidden under the pillow. She pretended to be asleep, but her eyes were half open, her breathing irregular. Daniel approached her silently and tucked her in. That night, she slept on the couch. Not because of an argument, but because her chest was too heavy. It was a silent, accumulated sadness that could no longer fit inside him. His uneasiness grew. He began to observe more, to connect the dots. He discovered that Elena had gone out with a friend he had never heard of. That she had changed her phone password. That she was strangely distracted even when they were together. It was as if she were somewhere else all the time. Somewhere he didn't belong. One morning, as she was leaving for work, she kissed him on the cheek automatically. He stood in the doorway, looking at her as if he were looking at her for the last time. In that gesture, there was no longer love. There was only habit. In the following days, Daniel started coming home later, as an unconscious way of avoiding the silence. The home they had built together was getting colder, stranger and stranger. Their bedroom was a neutral space, where they slept like two strangers in bed separated by an invisible pillow. Sometimes he would hear her laughing to herself as she fiddled with her cell phone. Other times, the phone would ring and she would run to answer it in the hallway. He tried not to choke on it. He tried to remember the woman he had married, the plans they had made, the sunny Sundays on the porch drinking coffee and talking about life. But all of that seemed as distant as a faded photograph. It was then that the invitation to dinner came. It wasn't a special occasion, just an impulse on Daniel's part. He called her as if he were crying for help, trying to find some hidden spark. He chose a cozy restaurant, the kind that lends itself to honest conversations and well-served dishes. Elena accepted naturally, like someone who accepts a coffee with a distant acquaintance. In the car, he looked at her out of the corner of his eye, trying to decipher if there was something there. But she was impenetrable. Too serene. Too quiet. As if she were hiding something. When they arrived, they were taken to a discreet table near the window. They ordered wine, commented on the decor, and smiled at the waiter. It was like a well-functioning couple. But Daniel was tense. He felt something was hanging in the air. He tried to keep control, but there was a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away. He tried to make conversation, talking about the time they had traveled to the mountains, about the new project he wanted to start, about how beautiful she was. But she avoided him, answered with short words, and looked at her watch frequently. That was when he appeared. A tall, striking man approached the table with confident steps. Daniel noticed Elena's gaze change, as if she had been caught in an electric current. She said nothing. She simply stared at the stranger who, without even asking permission, stopped beside the table and extended his hand to her. There was a palpable tension. Daniel frowned, looked at Elena for some explanation. She hesitated for 2 eternal seconds, then stood up, straightened her dress and took the other man's hand. Daniel felt the ground disappear. He was speechless. The fork in his hand fell onto the plate. His heart seemed to have forgotten its beat. He stood up too, instinctively. His muscles tense, his gaze burning. He walked over to the man, tried to maintain his posture, but his voice came out lower than planned. He simply said, "Let her go now." The man looked at him unhurriedly, with a subtle smile on his lips, and replied with a coldness that cut through the air, "Didn't she tell you about us?" It was at that sentence that everything exploded inside him. Elena didn't look at him. She lowered her eyes. And in that gesture, Daniel understood everything. There was nothing more to ask. No answer would save him. What was before him was the confirmation of a collapse that had begun months ago, but that he refused to see. They left together, as if he wasn't there. As if all the years of partnership, all the promises, all the birthdays and Sundays and dinners and plans, were just a dispensable blur. Daniel stood there, not knowing whether to sit down, scream or simply disappear. When he finally managed to leave the restaurant, the night seemed colder than ever. He walked to his car, got in and stood there, in silence, for long minutes. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared at his own reflection in the glass and asked himself, when exactly did everything get lost? When he got home, he found the couch dark, the living room light still on. He sat down with his coat still around his shoulders, as if he were numb. There was no more anger. Just a deep, silent, cutting pain. It wasn't just about being betrayed. It was about the realization that everything he had built, everything he had loved, had been so unceremoniously rejected. As if he were disposable. As if he had never meant anything. And the cruelest thing was that he still loved her. Even now. Even after that. That morning, as the clock ticked slowly forward, Daniel made a decision. He would not drag himself along. He would not beg. He would not seek explanations. Something inside him had awakened. A strength that came from the abyss itself. He would rise again. Not to prove anything to Elena. But to prove to himself that it was possible to continue. And so he did. But what he didn't know yet was that what would come next wasn't just pain, it was revelation. A buried truth, an unspoken secret, a missing piece that would change everything. Because behind that betrayal there was something even bigger. Something he could never have imagined. And that, when it came to light, it wouldn't just close a story, it would rewrite the entire past. Daniel avoided the house for a few days. He stayed in a discreet hotel, the kind that doesn't ask questions when a man walks in alone, carrying only a backpack and the look of someone who's seen something he never imagined he'd see. The silent hallways and the made bed gave him a strange sense of relief, as if he was finally out of a play for which he was the last to know the script. He avoided touching his cell phone, ignoring Elena's calls and messages, which were now coming in frequently, all short, direct, as if the urgency could erase the brutality of what she'd done. He didn't answer. He felt that any words exchanged now would be premature, unfair to his own pain. He needed to understand what had happened, but more than that, he needed to understand who she had become. Or maybe, who she'd always been. In the hotel room, in a sleepless night, Daniel mentally went over every detail of the dinner. The lack of explanations, Elena's blank expression, the triumphant look of the man who took her by the hand. Something didn't fit. It wasn't just betrayal. There was something more in that gesture, that public boldness, that question asked with mockery, "Didn't she tell you about us?" That wasn't just infidelity. It was premeditated humiliation. It was exposure. As if the entire dinner had been set up. And that hypothesis slowly ate away at him. He began to investigate, discreetly, with the pain still throbbing in his chest. He searched through old messages, cross-referenced schedules, remembered events that had previously seemed innocent. The puzzle was coming together before him with a coldness that made him feel sick. Every detail, every absence, every small silence was now part of something bigger, and dirtier. It was at the end of that week that she sought him out in person. She knocked on the hotel door as if she had nothing left to lose. Daniel opened it on impulse, his anger controlled by exhaustion. She was different. Her hair tied up in a hurry, dark circles under her eyes and a look that mixed shame and despair. She entered silently, as if asking permission with her body. Daniel moved away, crossing his arms. She began to speak, too quickly, as if trying to overcome her guilt. She said she had made a mistake, that she had gotten confused, that the other man was not what he seemed. She said she missed home, her routine, his touch. He interrupted her. His voice was firm, cutting. He asked what "weak" meant. Why had that man said that? Elena stammered, tried to dodge, but he insisted. He said that he deserved at least the truth, even if it meant never looking at her again. And that was when she broke down. She sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily. She looked at him with a plea for mercy that found no echo. Daniel waited, mercilessly. And then, she said. She said that this man was not just a lover. He was someone she had known before she even met Daniel. Someone with whom she had a brief, unresolved relationship. When they got married, she cut off contact. Or she thought she had. Over time, he reappeared on social media, at events, in unexpected places. At first, she resisted. She avoided him. She told herself that she was happy, that she was fine. But something inside her, an unresolved, unburied part, responded to the call. Daniel felt his stomach churn. But there was more. Elena hesitated, bit her lip, looked down. She said she needed to tell him something she had hidden for a long time. Something that would change everything. And before he could say anything, she blurted it out, as if ripping her own skin, that man, was her first love. But not only that. He was someone she had planned to have a life with before she even met Daniel. A past relationship that had ended abruptly, for external reasons, due to family pressure. When she met him again, the idea of "what if" began to consume her. And that was when the mistake began. It wasn't a passing fling. It was a constant comparison. A fertile ground for fantasies never lived. Every time Daniel touched her, she wondered what it would have been like if it had been with him. Every time they made plans, she imagined what it would have been like to have made them with each other. Daniel felt the world spin. But she wasn't done yet. There was one final detail, the cruelest of all. She confessed that that dinner wasn't a coincidence. That she knew he would be there. That it was planned. That she wanted to see the two of them face to face. She wanted an answer to the doubt that was eating away at her. Who would she choose in the face of a real confrontation? She wanted her own heart to betray her feelings in the impact of the moment. She just didn't expect the other man to be so direct. She just didn't expect Daniel to react with such contained pain. She said that when she saw him standing there, motionless, not understanding what was happening, something inside her broke. That only later, in the silence of the empty house, did she realize what she had done. That she was no longer a confused woman. She was a woman destroyed by her own choices. Daniel stood up and paced around the room, not knowing what to do with his hands. His anger was rising like fire. He asked how she could have done that. He asked if it was all a lie. Elena was crying, but he was unmoved. He said she had robbed him of his chance to fight. That she had betrayed him not only with another body, but with the entire story of who she had been. She asked for forgiveness. She said she now knew who she loved. That, in the end, it was him. That it had always been him. That the other person was just a reflection of something unresolved, and that only by experiencing it did he realize the emptiness. Daniel didn't answer. He just looked at her as if he were seeing a stranger. A stranger with the face of the woman he loved. That night, he didn't sleep. He left the hotel, walked through the dark streets, feeling the cold wind on his face. He thought about the irony of it all. He had spent years with someone who carried an old love like a shadow. Who compared him in silence. Who had prepared a stage to unmask his own marriage. And now she said she regretted it. She said she loved him. But love is not doubt. Love doesn't make scenes. Love doesn't leave anyone alone at the table. When he got back to the hotel, he found a message from her. Short. Stripped of pride. Forgive me. I love you. He read it. Erased it. Time passed. Daniel moved away. He started a new routine, far from the places and objects that held their history. He didn't look for Elena. He didn't block her out either. He just followed her. And one day, while having coffee in a bookstore, he met someone. Someone who didn't resemble Elena at all. But who smiled with the same kind of kindness he had forgotten existed. They started talking. They exchanged books. Ideas. Comfortable silences. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt peace. Not overwhelming passion, nor urgency. Peace. And that was what he needed. Months later, on a rainy afternoon, Elena reappeared. She knocked on his door. She had the same look on her face as the first time she confessed everything. But now, there was more silence than urgency. She said she just wanted to see him one more time. She wanted to know if he was okay. When she walked in, she saw Daniel's new partner tidying up the bookshelf. Elena stopped, tried to hide her shock. He noticed. She introduced herself naturally. She said they were living together. That they were fine. She smiled, with difficulty. She said she was happy for him. That this was what she had always wanted. Daniel thanked her, with a calm tone that hurt more than any scream. On the way out, she turned around one last time. She said she still loved him. That she would always love him. But she understood that she had lost. And that this loss was entirely hers. He just nodded. There was nothing more to say. After she left, he closed the door. And never looked back. Elena disappeared for weeks after that last visit. No message, no phone call. Daniel went on with his life with a tranquility he had earned, cultivated with effort and vigilance against his own ghosts. He wasn't the kind of man who harbored hatred, but he was also no longer the same one who gave in to the slightest gesture of regret. His heart no longer responded to memories as it once did, and the days with his new partner brought a lightness he never thought he would feel again. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, he was free from all the pressures of being what the other expected. He just was. And that was enough. However, there was a shadow that insisted on haunting the moments of silence. Not the shadow of Elena herself, but of what she represented, a part of his story that, although closed, still reverberated unexpectedly in the corridors of his memory. And it was in this void, in this blind spot between the end and the beginning, that a new twist emerged. One morning, Daniel received a letter. It was handwritten on plain paper. There was no return address on the envelope, but the handwriting gave it away immediately. It was from her. When he opened it, he found no longer a plea for forgiveness, but a request. A single, direct request. She wanted to talk one last time, in a specific place, far from the city, where no one would know them. She said there was something she needed to say in person, and that after that she would disappear from his life for good. Daniel stood there, with the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of the decision. He could ignore it. He could move on without another page. But something in the tone of the letter disturbed him. It was not an emotional appeal, there was no attempt to move or bring back the past. It was more like a settling of accounts. And even though he had already closed the chapter with Elena, he felt that perhaps there was still one last door ajar. He decided to go. For the last time. The place he had chosen was an old inn in the mountains, one of those discreet refuges surrounded by trees and silence. He arrived late in the afternoon, the sky tinged with a faded orange hue. Elena was already waiting for him on the porch, sitting with a cup in her hands, dressed in simple clothes, her hair tied up carelessly and a look that no longer carried supplication. Only acceptance. When he approached, she stood up slowly. The greeting was dry, formal. No hug, no touch. She indicated with a subtle gesture the table inside, where the ambience heated by a fireplace insulated them from the biting cold outside. They sat facing each other, like two witnesses before an intimate trial. She began to speak bluntly. She said that she had spent the last few days going over everything they had experienced, trying to understand the exact point where everything began to fall apart. She confessed that she regretted it, yes, but that her biggest regret was not the betrayal itself, but rather her cowardice. The cowardice of not having faced her own feelings sooner, of not having told the truth when there was still time so that he would not lose himself inside her. She said that she discovered too late that loving someone also requires courage to let go of the past, and that the man she had run away with was less about love and more about wounded pride, a desire to reclaim something that had already died. Daniel listened to her in silence. His eyes were fixed on her, but his mind wandered to other versions of that same face. The woman he woke up with whom he discussed the weather and movies and books. The woman who slept on her side, with the sheet up to her chin, and who laughed when he slipped his cold foot under the covers. The woman he tried to love completely and who, in the end, used that love as a mirror to see his own faults. But he still didn't say anything. He let her continue. Elena took a deep breath, and for the first time hesitated. She said that the man she had run away with had disappeared. There was no connection, no explanation. He had simply disappeared from her life as soon as he had appeared, leaving her in the emptiness of a bad choice. And it was in that abandonment that she understood everything. That she realized that Daniel was not the opposite of the other, he was whole. He was real. He was the home she had destroyed because she had confused stability with boredom and depth with absence. He then spoke, and his words came like stones rounded by time. He said that it hurt, of course, but that today he no longer felt angry. That forgiveness had already been given, not to her, but to himself. That he needed to forgive in order to breathe again. But that this did not mean forgetting, much less returning. He said that she had pushed him into the abyss with her own hands, and it was there, deep down, among the rubble of his self-esteem, that he discovered who he really was. And that no matter how much she missed him now, he no longer missed her. Elena lowered her eyes, tears came silently, but she did not try to explain herself. She just nodded slowly, as if accepting the sentence. There was a moment of silence, tense but not hostile. Then she stood up, walked to the window and said that she had one last thing to tell. It wasn't about the past, or her feelings. It was about the plan for that night's dinner. She said that the man who had accompanied her, the so-called "we," knew exactly where they would be. Because she had told him. But the thing was that he hadn't just agreed to be part of the scene. He had proposed. He wanted Daniel to know. To see. To lose. And Elena had accepted. Not because she consciously wanted to hurt Daniel, but because deep down she thought she needed a shock to know what she felt. And now, months later, she realized the absurdity of having put her own love life on display, dragging Daniel along with her. She said that when she saw his reaction that night, something inside her had broken irreversibly. And that for the first time she understood what love was, not the thrill, not the adrenaline, but the silence after destruction, when there is still respect even among the pieces. Daniel closed his eyes. He needed to absorb it all. The planned betrayal, the exposure, the doubt turned into a spectacle. He had been the character in a grotesque performance, and only now did he realize how cold it all was. But no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it reopened wounds, none of it changed who he was today. Nor what he had built with the new woman who was by his side. And that was exactly what he said. That she could regret it, and that he understood. But that life had already moved on, and he had no intention of going back. That now, finally, he was at peace. Elena nodded silently. She didn't beg, she didn't dramatize. She was simply grateful for having met him, even if she had belatedly understood what he meant. They left the inn together, but went their separate ways. She, back to the small, lonely car that was waiting for her in the corner of the parking lot. He, heading for the road that would take him back home, where someone was waiting for him with a light smile and a clear look. And it was when he saw her, hours later, making tea in the kitchen, that Daniel felt something inside him close like a cycle. A cycle that began with pure passion, got lost in broken promises and ended there, in that new look, where there were no more ghosts or doubts. Only truth. And an open future, ready to be lived, far from all the questions that were left behind. On the way back, the sound of tires on the wet asphalt seemed to set the rhythm of Daniel's thoughts, now clearer, less heavy. The image of Elena standing next to the car, cowering in the face of her own end, remained in the rearview mirror of his memory as a symbol of something he no longer needed to carry. The encounter had been like the last piece of a painful but necessary puzzle. Knowing about the manipulation, the staging, and the emotional fragility behind her decisions didn't make him more bitter, nor did it move him toward resentment, it only reinforced how far he had distanced himself from that pain. It was like crossing a minefield and, upon reaching the other side, realizing that his own feet were firm, whole. And there was more than relief. There was a strange sense of justice, not the kind that takes revenge, but the kind that recognizes one's own worth even after having been reduced to almost nothing. Arriving home, he found the living room softly lit and the smell of freshly prepared dinner wafting through the air. She welcomed him with a silent hug, the kind that doesn't ask for explanations or stories. And in that simple gesture, Daniel understood the true value of what he was experiencing now. It was a relationship free of comparisons, free of unresolved pasts. A connection built calmly, on small but constant truths. There was no euphoria, there was tranquility. And after everything he had been through, he knew that this was worth more than any intense fantasy that ends in rubble. Still, something in him remained vigilant, not out of distrust, but because he had learned not to ignore his own limits. In the following days, Daniel resumed his routine with a lightness that surprised even him. His mind no longer wandered through the corridors of the past, nor did he search for explanations between the lines of what had been said or done. Work once again occupied his focus, and the simple moments with his new wife became the anchor of his recovery. Every look from her, every sincere gesture, served as a living reminder that love was possible after pain, but that this love needed to be chosen each day, consciously. And Daniel now made choices clearly. He no longer ran away from silence or from internal questions. And, above all, he had freed himself from the need to have answers for everything. Despite this, Elena's presence had not completely disappeared. Her name was avoided, but her shadow still lingered in small corners, a song playing on the car radio, a familiar smell in random hallways, a place they used to go that he now avoided. It wasn't nostalgia, it was memory. And memory, Daniel knew, doesn't fade, it just settles. But what surprised him most was realizing that, over time, he had stopped wishing everything had been different. He no longer fantasized about what he could have done to prevent the betrayal, or about what would have happened if he had reacted differently. That was the past. And the past, for those who survive, is just a chapter turned over. One ordinary afternoon, while organizing some old documents, Daniel found an envelope hidden in the back of a drawer that belonged to Elena. It was a letter, different from the one she had delivered to the inn. Dated months before their separation, the letter had never been sent. With steady hands, he opened it and read it in silence. In it, Elena described the confusion she felt, the doubt between staying in a safe marriage or giving in to the temptation of what seemed unfinished. She wrote with brutal sincerity, speaking of the fear of hurting him, the fear of losing herself, and the guilt that had already eaten away at her even before she had made any decision. What struck him most was that the letter ended with an unfinished sentence, as if it had been interrupted by something more urgent, or by cowardice. When he finished reading, Daniel took a deep breath and, without hesitation, threw the letter into the lit fireplace. There was nothing in it that could change what he felt. It was too late to be moved by the regret that he had never had the courage to express in time. Over the next few months, Daniel and his new partner continued to build something solid. She wasn't as intense as Elena, but she was stable. And after all that, he understood that stability isn't the absence of emotion, but the constant presence of respect. With each gesture she made, with each calm conversation, Daniel felt more whole. He began to share with her parts of his story that he had previously kept to himself, not as a lament, but as a way of saying, "I'm here, but I come from a dark place." She listened attentively, without judgment, and this listening space was what further cemented the bond between them. Life was slowly getting back on track. But it wasn't all about the current love. There was something deeper, a maturation that had made him a different person. Daniel began to see people differently. He understood that betrayal was not just about physical infidelity, but about the breaking of a narrative built by two people. And that, when this narrative falls apart, what really remains is what you can build on your own. He had finally built it. And although the damage had been great, the reconstruction brought something he had not had before, self-awareness. But one Sunday, while he was drinking coffee on the porch, he received an unexpected call. On the other end of the line, a female voice identified herself as Elena's sister. She was distressed. She said that Elena had suffered an emotional breakdown and was hospitalized. That she spoke incoherently, that she asked about him repeatedly. Daniel remained silent. His heart raced, not out of love, but out of a sense of emotional responsibility that still lingered. He asked if she was in danger. The answer was vague, but worrying. He said that the doctors had suggested that she review some pending issues from the past, that she close cycles that still held her captive. And that, among these pending issues, he was the main one. Daniel hung up and stood there, motionless. It was a dilemma. He didn't love her anymore, he didn't want that story in his life anymore. But he knew that, despite everything they had been through, despite all the flaws there was a part of him that understood the depth of the pain of someone who loses themselves. He spent the day torn. He thought about talking to his partner, but he didn't know how to explain. In the end, he wrote a letter. Not to Elena, but to himself. A text where he put everything he felt, everything he had experienced, everything he wanted to forget. At the end of the letter, he wrote a question: if I go see her, will I be saving her, or betraying myself? He folded the paper, put it in his pocket and went for a walk. He didn't take his cell phone. Just himself and his thoughts. When he returned, he found his partner sitting in the living room, reading. He watched her for a few minutes without her noticing. And then he was sure. He wouldn't go. Because what he had experienced with Elena, as strong as it was, had already been resolved. He didn't need another visit, nor an official farewell. What he needed was to continue living with integrity, without breaking with the values he had rebuilt with so much effort. The next day, he sent a message to Elena's sister, thanking her for the call, wishing her strength, but making it clear that his part in the story had ended. And in doing so, Daniel realized that the true end does not happen when everything falls apart. It happens when pain stops controlling your decisions. When you can look back without kneeling before the memory. The pain passes. The loss settles. And self-love, if well cultivated, becomes the best answer to everything that was left unexplained. And it was exactly this answer that he chose to keep silent, as the most valuable part of what had finally become his past. The following week unfolded in silence, but not in passivity. Daniel continued his days with the same discipline he had adopted since the end of that turbulent phase. The decision not to visit Elena had been definitive, not out of cruelty or indifference, but out of respect for what he had built after everything. He felt neither pride nor relief, only firmness, the calm conscience of someone who no longer needed to look back to understand what he felt. Life flowed with new tones. The small details, like making a different coffee, discussing a new travel destination, or simply walking aimlessly alongside someone who didn't demand that he be anything other than who he was, became the anchors of his peace. Still, inside a part of him, there was a discreet knot, which didn't bring pain, but which suggested that the story had not yet completely closed the cycle for everyone involved. It was one unexpected afternoon that everything took a different turn. He was at a small event, an outdoor art exhibition organized by mutual friends. He was walking slowly among the twisted metal sculptures, listening to the conversations around him, when he saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Elena's sister. She hesitated when she saw him, as if she were considering whether to approach him. But after a few seconds, she approached him, her expression restrained, filled with something between respect and urgency. Daniel, surprised, greeted her politely, but did not hide his discomfort. Before he could say anything, she spoke. She said she understood why he had distanced himself, that she did not want to disturb his life, but that Elena had left something for him. Something she had written shortly before being hospitalized again. Something that, according to her, should only be delivered if Daniel seemed at peace. His sister hesitated, then took a letter from her bag, carefully folded and protected by a simple envelope. She said she did not know the contents, that she had only promised to deliver it. Daniel took it with a restrained nod, and his sister walked away with the ease of someone fulfilling a mission. For a moment, Daniel considered putting the letter away without reading it. But there was something about the weight of the paper, the subtle scent of Elena's faded perfume, that drew him to a secluded bench. He sat down and opened it, allowing her last voice to reach, not his ears, but the center of his chest. The handwriting was firm, very different from the first letter. And the words asked for nothing, no apologies, no return. She wrote with surprising, almost clinical clarity. She told how, after the breakup, she delved into herself, seeking to understand the reasons behind the need to sabotage the one who loved her most. She admitted that she had felt empty even before the betrayal, and that she had projected an unattainable perfection onto Daniel, which only increased her feeling of inadequacy. She said that she had never been able to sustain her own love because she had never known how to receive it without feeling guilty. And perhaps that was why she had destroyed herself. To punish herself. To test the limits of those who loved her, hoping that, by being abandoned, they would confirm her belief that she was unlovable. The final words didn't beg for anything. They just thanked her. For having loved her, for having endured her, for having left when she didn't know how to ask. The letter ended with a single sentence, delicate and disarming: "You were the most beautiful love that I destroyed because I didn't know what to do with something so true." Daniel sat for a long time after reading it. He didn't cry, he didn't smile. He just took a deep breath and watched the clouds slowly move across the sky. The letter didn't change anything, but it completed everything. It was the emotional ending to a story that had already ended, but that needed to be understood until the end. He folded the paper carefully, put it in his coat pocket, and decided that he wouldn't take it home. On the way, he stopped at a small park, where children ran around and parents chatted carefreely. He found a wooden trash can and, without hesitation, placed the envelope there. Not out of contempt, but as if burying a symbolic object after a farewell ritual. The days that followed were light. For the first time, his body felt lighter when he slept, his thoughts clearer when he woke up. The woman who now shared his life with him noticed. She didn't ask him directly, but her eyes reflected understanding. At a silent dinner, she held his hand and said simply, "Thank you for choosing me." And those words, simple, direct, unpretentious, echoed in him like a blessing. Because that was it, he had chosen. And now, with more awareness, with more maturity, with more truth. There were no more doubts, no more hanging bridges. There was no room for comparisons, no more ghosts in imaginary dinners. Time passed. The relationship grew. Not with explosions and grandiose promises, but with the silent repetition of care. Daniel discovered that true love, after being betrayed, was like relearning to trust yourself before trusting the other person. It meant respecting your own limits, communicating your own pain, not waiting for the other person to guess. And she understood that. She didn't demand more than he could give, but generously offered everything she could. One day, while sorting through boxes of old books to donate, he found a forgotten photograph, tucked between the pages of a novel. It was an old picture of him and Elena in a park, smiling at the camera, carefree. He showed it to his partner, who looked at him naturally and said, "You seemed happy." And he answered honestly, "That day, I was. But it was a kind of happiness that made it hard for me not to see what I was missing." She simply nodded, and together they put the photograph in a pile of things they no longer needed. There was no discomfort, no insecurity. Because now there was transparency. And that was the solid ground on which their new love was based. The following week, they decided to take a short trip. A weekend away, to a quiet coastal town, where they could walk along the seashore and talk without rushing. The sun was shy, but the clear sky seemed to reflect the new moment they were living in. One night, sitting on the cold sand, he told her a detail he had never told her before. He talked about dinner, about how he had been left alone at that table. She listened attentively, without interrupting, with her eyes fixed on his. And at the end, she simply said, "You survived. And not only that, you became an even better person." Daniel smiled. Not out of vanity, but because, for the first time, he recognized this truth within himself. The return trip was peaceful. Nothing seemed urgent. There was no longer any rush to fix the world, or to make up for lost time. Everything was where it should be. The pain had been useful. The new love, welcome. And the peace, deserved. When he got home, Daniel stopped for a second before entering, looking at the door, as if realizing that, sometimes, the greatest revenge life offers is not seeing someone else suffer, but seeing yourself, whole. After the fall. After the chaos. After everything. And realizing that you not only survived, but that you finally learned to live. Time, with its relentless patience, took every remnant of what had once been a promising love story to the realm of memory. Daniel built a new life that, although free of great euphoria, was marked by a rare serenity, achieved after overcoming the emotional ruins of a betrayal that almost cost him his identity. His days became filled with simple things that carried meaning, making coffee for two people, sleeping hand in hand, sharing silences that did not weigh down. The woman who walked beside him today did not know the details of the pain he carried, but she knew how to respect every scar she found, and because of that, the love they built was more solid than any oath he had made in the past. Daniel had not only rebuilt himself, he had grown, matured, and discovered that true happiness was not in intensity, but in calm reciprocity. Elena's name rarely came up. When it did, it was as a vague memory, like a distant echo of a life that no longer belonged to her. But fate, with its perverse sense of irony, still had one last page to turn. Months after the last letter, Daniel received an envelope with official letterhead. It was a legal notice, requesting his presence as a witness in a lawsuit involving the man who had once been with Elena that night at the restaurant. The so-called other. The document did not explain many details, but it did mention investigations related to document forgery and financial fraud linked to a specific circle in the city's business sector. At first, Daniel hesitated. He did not want to be dragged into that shadow any longer. But out of respect for the truth, and perhaps as a final act of closure, he agreed to appear. At the hearing, when he entered the room and saw that man again, the impact was almost nil. He no longer occupied any space inside Daniel. It was just a face aged by arrogance and now corroded by consequences. Elena was there too, but her expression was different. She bore the traces of defeat, not only judicial, but emotional. Her eyes were dull, her shoulders hunched, her skin pale. When their eyes met, there was no more guilt or blame. There was only the realization of what had been lost forever. After his brief and objective testimony, Daniel left without looking back, and at that exact moment, he realized that he no longer needed to avoid remembering her, because remembering her no longer hurt. And perhaps, that was the greatest symbol of freedom someone could have. The months went by naturally. Their current relationship progressed with the delicacy of someone in no rush to prove anything. Over time, they decided to get married. A discreet wedding, for a select few. No exaggeration, just a silent commitment between two people who decided to share their lives knowing exactly what they wanted to preserve. At the altar, Daniel didn't think about the past, he didn't have flashbacks, he didn't compare. He only thought about what he had built, what he had overcome, and how difficult it was to relearn how to trust. And there, in that moment, when he said yes, he also said a definitive goodbye to everything that had once destroyed him. After the trial, Elena disappeared from society. She moved to another city, according to brief comments among acquaintances. They said she lived in seclusion, working as a teacher in a simple school, far from the demands that had previously put so much pressure on her. Some said she had become calmer, more silent. But no one knew for sure. What was known was that she never tried to contact Daniel again. And perhaps that was the only great act of respect she showed him. Silence, in the end, became her way of asking for forgiveness. As for the man who was with her that night, the one who sarcastically challenged Daniel, the one who helped set up the scene of betrayal like a cruel play, he did not escape unscathed. The investigations progressed, and fraud, lies and dangerous alliances came to light. Convicted, he lost not only his prestige, but his name. And he was forgotten. Like all those who build on manipulation and vanity. His downfall did not serve as a relief for Daniel, but as confirmation of something he already knew: life is responsible for returning, with precision, what each one plants. The cycle was finally closed. Not with revenge, nor with shouted responses. But with the construction of a new story in silence. Daniel, now the father of a small girl, understood the weight of choices like no one else. He did not live in fear of the past, but with the awareness that every action leaves its mark, not only on others, but on ourselves. And this understanding made him not only a better man, but a more attentive, more present, more human father. He knew that what destroys a relationship is not the mistake, but the insistence on hiding what hurts. And so he lived with transparency, not as a form of atonement, but as a new way of loving. The story ends not with grandiose applause or redemption, but with the hardest of endings, real life continuing, despite the pain, with all its shades of gray. A life where each character found exactly what they needed, even if it wasn't what they wanted. Daniel found himself, Elena found silence, and the man who once thought he had won, found the consequences of his choices. And now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment below with your opinion and point of view. How do you think each character could have acted differently? Your participation is very important. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive other intense stories like this one, which touch where the truth hurts the most and where courage is most needed. Remember, cheating doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, respect, destroys love and often ruins who we were before we were cheated on. That's why this channel does not support, encourage or romanticize any type of cheating. Here, we tell stories that show that every choice has its weight, and that the truth, no matter how hard it is always the best path. Until the next story.